So how did you do answering these questions with our census data? I hope it went well, and I hope you started to see the power of these kinds of functions and actions like filtering, especially now that we have a relatively large data set where it's much harder to do things manually by hand or in our head. For each of these questions I asked you, there are at least two approaches you could take. I think for each of them, you could use functions where you write an equation, or you could be using filtering and then writing some equations or using some other tools. I'm going to show you how to do it each way, and hopefully you can check what you did, and then you can also see an alternative to your approach here. I'm going to start by talking about functions. First question was the number of female respondents that we had in this survey of 500 people. This to me sounds like a COUNTIF question, right? We want to count up everybody in this survey who answered female for sex. So our range that we're going to apply our criteria to is that column of sex right there. And then we just want to enter in the word that we're looking for. And we want to make sure we spell it and capitalize it exactly the same way it's in the data so that we can ensure that Excel counts up every instance of the word female, which is what we're looking for. When I enter that in, we get the answer 232. We'll check this when we filter based on sex in a moment. But for now, that sounds about right because we would expect that maybe it's about a 50-50 representation in this data set. The next thing I asked you to do was to calculate the average personal income for people responding from the state of Illinois. This sounds like another conditional equation for us to use where we can do an average if. And so that's what we'll start with. We're going to do an average if, and the first thing we need to put in is the range for the criteria that we're putting in. Our if statement is going to focus on which state we're in, so that is the range we want, column B. And we know the criterion that we're going to be entering is that we want to make sure we're only averaging people from Illinois. Now the next thing that average if wants is what the range is that it's going to be averaging. We'll skip back up to the top here so that we can see our column. And what we want is we want this personal income range. So let's go all the way down to the bottom here. We'll make sure we get all of this data all the way down to value number 501. And there we are. Now we'll enter that in, and what should be happening is that we should be getting the average salaries only for people who meet the condition being in Illinois. When we do that, we see this value of $55,900 and some dollars. Again, we'll check that later. Finally, we have one other condition to meet here, or one other question to answer, and this should sound familiar based on another one that I asked before when we were dealing with the weather data. This is now a range in between, right? So there are multiple ways we can do this. This also sounds like an average if situation, but we have two conditions to meet. Greater than or equal to 30 years of age and less than or equal to 60 years of age. And so this is a case of average ifs because we have two conditions we need to put in here. So let's start doing this. Average ifs is what we want. And same thing. We first need to define that we're going to be averaging the personal income range. We'll just zoom all the way down to the bottom for that. Then the next thing we want is what range are we going to be using for our criterion. We're going to be using the age range. That is simple right there. And then our first criterion is we're going to say greater than or equal to 30 years of age. Then the nice thing is now that we're putting in our second age criterion, we're simply using the same column. We're not looking anyplace else, so we can just repeat that value. We're still looking in column D, but this time we have a different value that we're looking for. We're only interested in people who are less than or equal to 60 years of age. So we're finding people between, including these two values of 30 years of age and 60 years of age. Let's see how this works. In this case, we get a response of about $68,000. Now, as I said, we can check each of these using our filter functions too, and that's what we'll do in a moment here. You may have found that as you've been working with this, it can be a little frustrating because you can make little errors when you're typing in the arguments for these functions. Be patient, check yourself, delete it and start over if you need to. Follow along with what I did here. It takes a little bit of practice to be able to know exactly when to enter commas, exactly when to enter quotation marks, and remembering to close out your parentheses. But once you get the hang of it, I think you'll see that these functions are really powerful and effective tools. In a moment here, we'll check all of this with our filtering actions. So we just worked through answering these questions using equations and functions. Now we're going to do it using filtering, and this should be relatively quick because it's really intuitive, and I'm sure you found that out if you used this tool yourself. Remember, the first thing we're doing is trying to find out how many female respondents we had in this survey, and so we're going to filter based on sex. We don't have to type anything in, we just click on this button, we get these little pull downs, and we want to make sure that we only have female chosen. Once we do that, our data set gets smaller. We know this because we have blue numbers to the left and we have missing numbers. Now, how do we know how many individuals we have left? There are a couple things we can do here. We can just do a count of this. We can select it all. But I've expanded my view a little bit. If you look way down here on the left, you can see that it's showing 232 of 500. And so it's telling us that we only had 232 that met this condition. If we go ahead and select all of this, we also see our count on the lower right, 232. We could visually confirm that these all only say female, but I'm inclined to trust Excel that it did this filtration correctly. And we know this because it confirmed what we found when we used COUNTIF, 232 females in this data set. Let's clear that out. What's the next thing we want to do? The next thing we wanted to do is we wanted to find out the average salary for people in Illinois. We can use a similar approach here. We have a lot of states. We'll just clear all of those out and we'll only select Illinois. There we go right there. A much smaller data set. This is nice. Our total personal income column is right there. One thing you'll notice is we don't even have to do any calculations. If we highlight those cells, if we highlight that range, again down here on the bottom, Excel is conveniently giving us an average. We can still calculate it. We should still use the average function and store that value someplace else. But just very quickly, we can see that this confirms what we found before. $55,900 or so is the average salary that we have reported in the survey for Illinois. Again, very quick and easy to do this. Finally, you remember our last question that we had was people between the ages of 30 and 60 inclusive finding their total personal income on average. We used average ifs because there are two conditions to meet, but what we're going to do now is we're going to use number filters, again using the between category so we can do this. And this is nice because it's really parallel where we see it's like average ifs. We have two conditions we need to meet. Greater than or equal to 30 years of age, less than or equal to 60 years of age. Now this has reduced our entire data set to only people between 30 and 60 years of age. And again, we can scan through and visually verify this. I don't feel a particular need to do that. So instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to select all of the remaining data. And again, look down to the lower right-hand side. We see there are 213 people in this category, and their average personal incomes are about $68.5 thousand per year, which is what we calculated previously. Two different ways to do this work. Hopefully, you had good success figuring out these tools. And remember, Excel can be a little picky, just like any software programs, but practice makes perfect, and this practice should have gotten you quite a few steps closer to feeling really comfortable doing these kinds of advanced calculations and manipulations in Excel. Congratulations, I think things have been going great, and you're almost around the bend to week 4, the final week of Excel for the 99%.